much for coming this evening. Tonight we're here to talk about Greg's exhibition Flight Path. Greg's exhibition is the story of his adventure in Venice recently. So that's going to be fabulous. I'd also like to introduce you to Dr. Shireen Huda. Shireen is an art curator, she's an art historian. She's the only person I know who's a doctor of the art market. And today she's here to interview Greg and help tease out some of his adventures. So I think we're all in for a really charming and interesting evening.
Thank you. I think we've got such a lovely little intimate gathering. We'll keep things reasonably informal. So basically I'm just going to ask Greg a series of questions which will really help to tease out a bit more about the premise of his work and his inspiration, and then we'll just sort of throw it open and see if anybody has any questions or if anyone wants to add anything. So to kick it off, I guess to ask Greg about this great centrepiece of the exhibition, which is Flight Path to Venice, the etchings behind us here. They were done about a year ago when Greg had a residency at a very prestigious school in Venice. And I guess we all know that many artists have been inspired by the rich culture and the architecture in Venice over the years, and I thought it would be good if Greg could tell us a bit about how being in that city in Venice influenced his etchings in particular.
Well, Venice is one of the world's most iconic tourist destinations, so for any artist to be there for any period of time is pretty amazing. And many famous artists have gone there over the centuries to paint Venice. So it's quite overwhelming as an artist to go to a place like that because it's almost like a cliche in terms of chocolate box type images of the canals and all the buildings. So very quickly when I arrived there at this the School di Grafica, I was one of, I think 30 years they've had artists in residence at the school, and immediately artists, when they come to Venice, start painting canals and buildings and gondolas, etc., etc., etc. So it's just sort of seemed to be a natural thing to do, which I started doing, and then very quickly one of the professors at the school pointed out that the work that she saw on my website, which was obviously very Australian inspired, had nothing to do with cute little pictures of Venice. So why was I doing this? Because she saw all these other artists constantly coming into Venice and doing exactly that. And that probably reinforced by the end of the month I was there my Australianness more than anything else. So sometimes you have to go to another country and to realise what you've actually got, which is being Australian, is quite unique in itself.
Okay, and you've been, an art practitioner and you've worked with Indigenous communities and been an arts manager for many years as well. How has working with Indigenous artists or Indigenous communities inspired your work?
Aboriginal artists often see the world through an aerial view, despite the fact that the majority of them have never been in an aircraft before. And a lot of that's to do with their religion, where their medicine men believe that they were flying over the country, and I've met a couple of traditional medicine men who have told me that they will fly. And these are men now in that generation of Aboriginals who are 90 years old and who soon won't be with us. And the scientific interpretation of this astral travelling is that a lot of medicine men use herbs, Australian herbs, which do include narcotics. And so just like American Indian shamans who believe they can fly, it's believed that an explanation for this flying is actually a hallucinogenic trip. Having said that, I've also met many female artists who've never been under the influence of any kind of medicine or ceremonies which would be inducing an artificial sensation of flying, and yet all of their landscapes are of traditional maps of the countryside from an aerial perspective, which they can read like a map. So in terms of my looking at the world from above from an aeroplane, I can see all the dots and all the rivers and all of the things that they can see without having been in an aircraft. That's quite interesting. And I've also looking at the way Aboriginals paint flat on the ground. Traditionally, we as Western artists paint on an easel. Having said that, there are a couple of well-known Australian artists such as Fred Williams who used to lay works flat and flip them around to get more interesting composition. So those are just some of the influences on my own work coming from Aboriginal people, including using natural ground ochres, such as I'm using in a lot of my works, and working on wood also, which is obviously a traditional painting surface with shields and carved bark paintings and so forth.
Yeah. So talking about aerial perspective again and flying, I guess, could you tell us a bit more about how you use flying to inspire your work and the satellite images and things that also aids your work, I suppose?
Yes. Well, in the case of this particular exhibition, I flew to Europe on an A380, which has a camera on the wing, on the tail of the aircraft, and also on the undercarriage, which you can log into through your computer monitor in front of you. So aside from the view out of the window, which I was very lucky, it happened to be fine weather for most of the trip, etc., I also had this new technology where I could get a perfect view of the ground below as we were taking off and landing and flying, and also from the tail, and then the satellite map that goes, that tracks the flight over the Euphrates River or wherever we happen to be at that particular time. So all of those things had me in a frenzy with my sketchbook, which I then follow up with when I get to the destination by Googling on Google Earth satellite images of the same locations, and I can get a much more accurate, clear satellite view of the same locations that I've done drawings of.
So would you say that your works are literal interpretations of the landscape?
Yes and no. Because in the case of these etchings that pretty much came out of the sketchbook on the flight, they're very quick impressions of that countryside below, and I use those sketches from the sketchbook as a basis for these etching plates over in Venice.
Okay.
Whereas in the paintings I've got a bit more time to actually do a lot more research back onto the sketches.
Yeah. And I'm always interested in the relationship between different media, I guess, and as an artist who works, well, obviously here has used etching as well as paintings, can you tell us whether there's any relationship between those two different media, between your etching and your paintings?
Yes, I think going back through history, Rembrandt was one of the first painters to actually use a body of prints to complement his career as a painter, and that partly came out of that middle-class Dutch ethic that he wanted ordinary people to afford to buy his work who couldn't afford to buy his paintings, and that's become a tradition in Western history. Picasso was also particularly onto that, and then in Australia, most major Australian artists, John Olson, Brett Whiteley, Fred Williams and so forth, Charles Blackman, have all gone on to produce a body of works that relate to their paintings. So yes, from that point of view, also creatively, printmaking is a wonderful addition to painting because you're forced with an etching or a screen print to minimise down your composition to, instead of like maybe 100 colours in that painting there, this might be limited down to 3 colours. So it's technically a very interesting medium to work with, very labour intensive, which is people don't generally realise how much work is involved in producing just one print. And also it's often a happy accidents of printmaking where there's been an acid spill, or you've overexposed the plate, or you've made a line in the wrong place, and you've kind of got to live with these errors, and sometimes it's those errors that actually make it a really unique and wonderful work.
Serendipity.
Yes.
Yeah. So you were talking about, how much work is involved in doing something like one of these pieces. I wondered if you could just tell us a bit more actually about it. Because I'm personally interested in how much work is involved, because you're right, on one level they look very reductive and minimal, but obviously there is a lot of work that goes into getting them like that, and there are a lot of influences as well.
Yes. For example, in a plate like that one there, there are basically 3 colours in it. Aside from using the white paper as a colour, there's also an orange, there's a black, and then there's a bit of a midnight blue. So it's called a one-plate etching, which means all of those different shades of ink have actually been rubbed onto the plate at the one time before it's put through the press. So, and that will take anything from 30 to 40 minutes to just wipe the plate in those 3 colours. And then after it's put through the printing press, that whole plate, which is a copper plate, has to be wiped completely clean and re-inked all over again. So when you're doing an edition of 20 or 30 prints, that's the amount of time it would take to hand wipe and put through the press, allowing for a perfect print, no mistakes, and anything can sometimes happen. So that's why it's incredibly labour intensive just to do one print. So all hand printed.
Well, those are kind of the main questions that I wanted to ask you to tease out a little bit more about your art practice. But I thought if anybody has any questions, or if anybody wants to just have a look at the works individually, or have a chat with either one of us or both of us, feel free.